Yani Aziz Bhai, how are you?
Ya Ali Madad,
Maula Ali Madad.
we are ready for you whenever you are. Zai Lalani does not require introduction. He's been with us for many time, and we thank him for all his time and knowledge that he's been sharing with us. I know it takes a long time to prepare this kind of sessions, and we thank you for this. Ji Bismillah.
Thank you, Aziz Bhai. Thank you, everybody, and Yani Madad to everyone.
Ya Ali Madad.
So obviously last week we had the first session of duality and the cyclical nature. So what I thought was that we would just very, very quickly have a recap just to remind ourselves of some of the key elements that we had. So the first thing that we talked about was really the fact that we speak about the laws of God, the Sunnah of Allah, and we clarified that these laws of God are not limited to religious or spiritual things. So these laws of God from an Islamic point of view are both spiritual and physical. So everything we consider to be science, everything we consider to be non-religious, is also encompassed within the laws of God. We then went through a number of examples of how cycles work in nature. We looked at a variety of things, the cycle of the weather, the cycles of trees, the cycle of the caterpillar, and we looked at how, when we actually think about what is around us, everything seems to work in cycles. And similar to that, we also looked at the fact that actually everything seems to be in pairs. There's a duality in existence. And not only is it that there are cycles and there's duality, but that actually these two concepts are very, very intrinsically linked. That the duality drives the cycles, and the cycles requires the duality. And one of the other things that we spoke about, which I didn't dwell on too much, but it's actually something that if we think about it, is actually quite important from a spiritual aspect, is that when we looked at the examples of specifically the caterpillar and the butterfly, there is this concept that within these cycles, there is actually the term that's known as metamorphosis. It is a change of the nature of the being. And if we think about what religion is about, what our spiritual journey is about, it is actually about a metamorphosis. It is actually about a change of the nature of our being in terms of how we look at ourselves. And the most important point that we made last week was really that if we look at this whole concept of duality and cycles, that the most important principle that we had to take out of it was actually that of dynamism. There is a constant movement. There is a constant chain of events. Nothing is standing still. Nothing is not doing something. There is a constant change occurring in everything. And that, from a spiritual point of view, is what life is about. That there is a constant dynamism. And the other thing that we need to recap is the three principles that we looked at within the Quran. And those three principles were encompassed in three very specific ayats, but there are many more ayats that talk about this, but these are three of the most common that are used. So the first one was 21:33. And he it is who created the night and the day, and the sun and the moon. They float, each in an orbit, each going around each other. And the principle that ayat shows us, like many others, is that of the cyclical nature of God's creation. We then had 36:40. It is not for the sun to overtake the moon, nor doth the night outstrip the day. they float each in an orbit. And the principle that's pointed out here is what is known as non-posteriority and non-anteriority. One does not come before the other. Neither is before the other. If we think about day and night, which one comes first? If we think about the seasons, which one comes first? There is no first, there is no last, except from a relative perspective. And the last one we looked at was 36:36. Glory be to him who created pairs of all things, of what the earth grows, and of their kind, and of what they do not know. And again, there are several verses that indicate this concept of everything having a duality, everything being in twos. And we then went on and we looked at several indications within the spiritual aspects of faith about where this duality exists, where the cyclical nature exists. And we didn't explain them. We actually went through and looked at lots and lots of different examples in the Quran, in the Farmans, in the philosophy that we have about where these principles actually come out. So today we actually want to start looking in a little bit more depth about how these principles are actually executed within spirituality. What is the impact of these principles? Why are these principles so important? And how can we use them to better understand what spirituality is about, what our own life journey is about? Ultimately, everything we do needs to come back to, why do I want to understand this? I want to understand it because I need to understand my purpose in life. So one of the things that we did refer to last week was the very famous ayat in the Quran about from Allah we have come and to Allah we will return. And that cycle of from Allah we have come and to Allah we shall return, what our peers and dais have explained, and they use particular terminology, is that there is the concept of this world, the physical world we see, and that world, what we tend to call the spiritual world or paradise, whatever name you give it. The technical terms that the peers have given those things is Alam-e Amr for that world, or the world of command, and Alam-e Khalq, or the world of creation.
Papagaya ci tapis.
So
Ma
this
tiġi
world
għad
and
kux
that
xkana
world
taċen.
form a cycle. They are two parts of a cycle. And the important part of this principle is not that there is that world and we are here, and that there is simply a one-way journey. Remember, from Allah we have come, so we have come down to this world, and to Allah we shall return. We will go back from this world to that world. But the important bit is, it is not a single event of come down and return. What our peers have explained in many of the Ismaili books is that there is actually a cycle that continues, and we will come to this in a few more slides. There is a continuation of this coming and returning. So immediately within that concept, we have this thing of the duality, that there is two parts to the whole of creation. Creation is not about this physical world. We have the spiritual world and we have the physical world. And that duality causes a continual movement between these two phases. Going back to that principle that we had about non-posteriority and non-anteriority. It's something that I think we tend not to think of in that way. But from an Ismaili esoteric perspective, there is actually no posteriority or anteriority between these two worlds. There isn't a first and a last. There isn't that the Alam-e Amr came first and then the Alam-e Khalq came second. And in the memoirs of Sultan Ahmad Shah, he has indicated to this fact when he said that creation is a constant and perpetual event. If something is constant and perpetual, it has been going on forever and will go on forever. There is no starting point and there is no ending point, so you cannot have something being first and something being second. It's logically impossible. And the other example that I used in last week was this whole very famous equation that we use regularly to try and explain things, which is E equals mc squared, Einstein's equation. There is a constant exchange between energy and matter. When we talk in scientific terms, everybody says, wow. Yes, there is a constant exchange between energy and matter. But from our perspective, there is a constant exchange between the spiritual and the physical. They are two parts of one whole that exchange all the time between those two phases. But this then, unfortunately, makes us ask a question. If this is not a simple create and return event, and it is a continual cycle, then the question I would need to ask is, how long is this journey? Because most of us consider this journey to be our 70 or 80 or whatever number of years that we have in this life. And the next question that comes, obviously, is where are we on this journey? Because it is not a simple matter of here or here. This is actually a cyclical movement, and I could be anywhere on that cycle. So what is the means of return? How are we meant to go on this journey? We have that concept of this world and that world. But the real nature that Ismailism specifically talks about is that those two, this world and that world, are actually encompassed within ourselves. This world being our body, and that world being our soul. And that when the Quran speaks about the paradise, speaks about the spiritual aspect, it speaks about the physical aspects. Although in one sense you can use the Quran to refer to what is around us and what we consider as paradise. When we go into the esoteric view is all about what is within. And the reason for having this duality of soul and body, and again, we go back to that principle, nothing came first and nothing came last. The reason why there is this continuous cycle between soul and body is actually encapsulated in that Firman of Imams, where he says, struggle is the meaning of life. And we'll come to that and what that actually entails a little bit later. But the really important part about this, the fact that from an esoteric point of view, this world and that world are really about what is within, starts to become clear when we look at what Maulana Ali has said. And he has said, he who recognizes himself recognizes his Lord. He did not say, continue to pray, and when you eventually get to what we call heaven, you will recognize your Lord. He clearly said, he who recognizes himself, he who recognizes his own soul, will recognize God. And he also said something else. Remember back to this world and that world. We have an entire universe around us, and we consider that whole spiritual domain to be something outside of ourselves. And yet, Maulana Ali said, do not consider yourself a small body when the entire universe is contained in you. Was he referring to the fact that all these galaxies out there, the billions of galaxies, are within our small body? No. But what he was referring to is that the entire spiritual universe, the entire context of what we call the spiritual world, is within ourselves. And that relates directly to that previous saying of Maulana Ali, in that he who recognizes his own soul will recognize his Lord. But then we also need to understand how we go on that journey. So if you look at the fact that we have that world, we have our souls, we have this world, we have our body. But for most of us who come into this world, that understanding is not something that most of us actually are very clear on. For a lot of people in the world, it is actually something they don't even consider to be real. And the Quran refers to a very specific terminology that it calls Majma'ul Bahrain, the confluence of two oceans, And that confluence of two oceans is the Imam of the time. It is the Imam of the time that straddles the ability to understand this world and that world. It is the Imam of the time who is there, who can actually tell you how this world and that world link. And it is only a person who understands both this world and that world and straddles both equally that can actually guide us on that journey. But one thing that I do hear quite regularly is that the Imam is different to you and I. And that is not the Ismaili concept. Absolutely, the Imam today is absolutely somebody whom we have to look up to and is very special. But according to the Quran itself, the guides that are sent are role models. They are not meant to be different. They are meant to be an indication of what each and every one of us can potentially achieve. And if the Imam's position, as indicated here, is that person that straddles both this world and that world, who can live in this world day to day and still have a full understanding and a full realization of that world, that is the potential of each and every human being. And it is the Imam who drives that whole cyclical nature about how we travel on this journey, how we try and understand, being in this world, being in this body, what our soul is, and what the power of the soul is, what the realization of the soul is. What does it mean when Maulana Ali said, "Do not consider yourself a small body when the entire universe is in you"? But more than anything, the Imam is a key manifestation of these two domains. Again, going back to the Memoirs chapter 8 is something that is so fundamental to understanding our principles. I refer to it time and again. And the term the Imam uses is that creation is a manifestation. The word we need to use more and more is manifestation and not creation. And the fact that we've said that the Imam is a role model of what we potentially can be, is clearly indicated in the Farman of Sultan Ahmad Shah, known as Usul Din. And in Usul Din, the Imam does not mince his words. He says clearly, you can be like Hazrat Isa, you can be like Hazrat Musa, like Pir Shams, like Pir Sadruddin. You can go even higher. So let's now look at how this cycle of guidance works. We've talked about the Imam as a guide, as the confluence of two oceans that straddles these two worlds. But there is another cycle, and this cycle of guidance is to do with the whole concept of evolution. The reason for cycles is that those cycles gradually increase our capability, they gradually increase our understanding. It is an evolution. And this evolution has two components. Again, duality. It has the component which we call the exoteric revelation. We know it as tanzil. Tanzil means to bring down. And tanzil is the role of the prophets. And the second half of the cycle is the esoteric revelation. And the esoteric revelation is known as ta'wil. Ta'wil means to take back to its origin. And that is the role of the Imams. And these two go hand in hand. There is the role of the prophets bringing down revelation, and the role of the Imams is explaining that revelation in context relevant to the time and place. And if we look at that concept of evolution, each cycle of revelation of Tanzil and then its Ta'wil increases the extent, the understanding of that divine message. And we'll explain that in a little bit more detail. And why do I use the term evolution? If evolution wasn't the right terminology, why was it that in the revelation of the Quran, God says, "This day have I perfected your religion"? Were all the other religions not perfect? Did God send messengers that were imperfect? Of course not. The messengers were not imperfect. The message was not imperfect. But there had to be an evolution of the message in terms of how people could understand, and bringing people up and educating people to a point where the message could get to a level where it was perfect in terms of they were now able to understand a much clearer message. So we've looked at this concept of the duality of the two worlds. We've looked at this concept of the evolution of guidance and revelation. So let's now look at, in a little bit more depth, this concept of the day of God. And in 22:47 it says, "And indeed, a day with your Lord is like 1,000 years of those which you count." And in 32:4-5 it says, "Allah it is who created the heavens and the earth, and what is between them, in 6 days. And then he established equality on the throne. No guardian have you, nor an intercessor beside him. Will you then not take heed? He renews the command from the heavens to the earth. Then it will ascend to him on the day which is equal to 1,000 years of your reckoning." So here we have the Quran in the message talking about the day of God being the equivalent of 1,000 days of mankind. What does that mean? We're all familiar with the story of the 6 days of creation, and it is a common story between the Abrahamic faiths. But from an esoteric point of view, the 6 days of creation has a much deeper meaning than 6 physical days of creation. And the Ismaili perspective specifically is that these, remember we talked about evolution, these are the 6 phases of evolution of religion. not of the physical creation of the world. You have Hazrat Adam, Hazrat Nuh, Hazrat Ibrahim, Hazrat Musa, Hazrat Isa, and Hazrat Muhammad. The 6 days of creation from our perspective, and this is well documented in the books of our peers and eyes. The 6 days of creation are the 6 phases of evolution of the perfection of our faith, which culminated in the revelation of the Quran. And that is why that term evolution makes more sense in terms of how we view this. But again, remember, this is a cycle. Each day is an evolution that goes in a cyclical form. But what about the 7th day, where God says that in Christian terms, he rested. But in our terms, we talk about equality. We talk about justice. And this is a completely different topic that would take more than 5 minutes or even a session to go through. But from an Ismaili point of view, those 6 days culminate in the 7th day, which is what is known as the day of retribution. But in our explanation that our peers have given, it is the day of justice. It is the day of spiritual awakening. So once this cycle of evolution occurs and you have the perfection of faith with the Quran, then it is the cycle of spiritual awakening. It is the cycle where the Imams now begin to explain the deeper aspects of the Quran, the deeper meanings of the Quran, the ta'wil of the Quran, and gradually evolving us. The evolution continues, evolving us into much more spiritual awareness. And that is why the Imams have gone from saying we follow Sharia to saying we follow Tariqah, because it is now within the scope of ta'wil. So we note that that had 6 days plus 1, 7. And what I want to come to now is actually this concept of the cyclical nature within Islam and its relation to the number 7. Because the number 7 is actually very, very key as a principle within how the cyclical nature works. And there are lots of references in the Quran to the number 7. There are lots of people have done lots of analytics where there are the number 7 hidden within certain Quranic contexts. The number 7 we spoke about last week is actually very key to even musical harmony. It exists within nature. There are 7 occurs in lots of different places. But specifically within the religious context, 7 has a very key role. So for example, there is a reference to the 7 spiritual heavens and paradises. There is obviously the 6 major prophets and what we have called the cycle of Qiyamah, the day of equality or the day of retribution. 7 again. And if we look at the major prophetic cycles, and we go back to the ayat that we read a couple of slides back, which talked about a day of God is as 1,000 days, 1,000 years of mankind. The 6 prophetic cycles, the 6 major prophets we looked at, the explanation of those 6 days is that there are actually 6 cycles of roughly 1,000 years each. That is the reference to the 1 day and the 1,000 years. Each of those prophetic cycles is roughly, not an exact number, but there is a rough equivalence to those being about 1,000 years. And the cycle of retribution, the cycle of Qiyamah, is another 1,000 years. You get your 6 plus your 1, and that gives you a total of 7,000 years. And that is a very fundamental number within what has been explained in terms of the esoteric principles of Islam. So this concept of 7 is actually a key metric that's used within the Quran and within the explanation of the Quran. And if we look at 1587, it says, "And we have certainly given you 7 repeated," and the glorious Quran. We have given you 7 repeated and the glorious Quran. Cycles, 7 repeated. And one of the ta'wils behind this ayah is that the 7 repeated is actually the 7 repetitions of the cycle of Imamat. And we'll again come to that in a minute. But this cycle of 7 is actually multifaceted. There is also 7 within 7. What do I mean? Each of the major cycles that we have talked about, so each of the major prophetic cycles, has within it minor cycles. And the way the minor cycles work is that each minor cycle actually has cycles of 7 imams. There is, and we'll come to why they're called cycles. But for those who may not have attended previous lectures, we went through this. Let me just explain one fundamental concept within Ismailism. When we speak about Hazrat Ali as the first Imam, Hazrat Ali was the first Imam that was openly revealed, that was openly declared by the last Prophet. That does not mean that Hazrat Ali was actually the first Imam. If we go back to that diagram that we had about this world and that world, and about the Imam being the confluence of 2 oceans, if that is a fundamental principle, how can that only be true after the time of the Prophet? And our concept is that it is not about only after the time of the Prophet. That is a constant principle that exists. And again, it's well documented in Ismaili books of Pirs and Dais that Imamat has always existed all throughout these evolutionary periods. But it was openly declared at Ghadir Qum with the advent of Maulana Ali. So each of these prophetic cycles was interspersed with a chain of Imams, just as we have a chain of Imams from Maulana Ali onwards. And that cycle of Imamat is actually looked at as a cycle of 7. Why is a cycle of 7? Well, if you look at what happens within the 7,000 years, the 7,000 years is a major change because we call it Qiyamah. Qiyamah is meant to be destruction and all sorts of things. Armageddon is what Christians call it. It is not how we look at Qiyamah. Qiyamah is a moment of spiritual awakening, spiritual awareness. But there is a culmination in the major cycle with what we call resurrection. But every prophet is also regarded as a resurrection because every prophet brought a new religion. Every prophet brought a change. Every prophet brought disruption within the community. So each of these major cycles had some level of what we call resurrection. But the same occurs within the minor cycles. Each of the 7 Imams causes a minor resurrection. There is a change occurring after every 7 Imams that has some significant impact. So this whole concept that we talked about, the Tanzil and the Ta'wil, the revelation and the spiritual progress, are based around this fundamental concept of a continual guidance that occurs in cycles of 7s. But there's something else that the Quran also refers to, or the Hadith, refers to. And there's a Hadith of the Prophet that says, The Quran is revealed on 7 letters. Each of those letters is sufficient and healing. And this hadith has actually been explained by a very famous Ismaili Dai, Sayyidina Mansur al-Yaman. And he explains it as follows. By the Quran is meant his wasi, legatee, his progeny, and asas. The asas is the title of the first imam of that cycle. In our case, Maulana Ali. So by the Quran is meant his wasi and asas, Maulana Ali. By the 7 letters is meant the pure imams from his children, of whom each one is sufficient in knowledge and wisdom and healing from inner diseases for the people of his time. So this, again, we don't want to go into too much depth in trying to explain this specific hadith, but it's just about explaining this concept of 7 is fundamental to a lot of our philosophy, and it has a very key effect in terms of how things work. So we talked about the 7 major cycles, and we talked about the fact that those 7 major cycles actually are broken down into sub-cycles, the 7 imams. But what about the other way? What about, is there anything that is cumulative about this number 7? We have looked at number 7, we've looked at how the 1,000 is broken down into 7s, we've looked at how the thousands add up to 7,000. And this concept of the numbers being broken down is true before Ali, through the 6 prophetic cycles and the imams all the way through, but it is also true after Ali. And if we look at where we are today, we have had 7 cycles of 7 imams, which gives us 49. And we actually need to take a step back and think carefully about what has happened in the last 100 years. If we look at the evolution of religion, and we look at the evolution of the prophetic cycles, the evolution towards the Quran, and then we look through the cycle of imams from the time of Ali all the way through to Maulana Sultan Muhammad Shah. There was a gradual development of humanity. There was a gradual change in our education, in our understanding of the world, and every 7 cycles there was a change within the imamate and how the imamate acted. But between the 48th and the 49th imam, as indicated clearly in Sultan Shah's will, there was a major change within science, within learning, within how the world is. If we look at how the world was 100 years ago and how it is today, it is more than just a simple evolution. It is more like a revolution. And that concept is actually, again, within our esoteric teachings. And if we look at books like Pir Nasir Khusro's Wajidin, there are indications to this kind of change at a particular point. And that particular point, from an Ismaili perspective, is actually very clearly indicated by this 49, the 7 cycles of 7. We are already in this cycle of what is known as Qiyamah, where there is a spiritual awakening. But the fact that we are now at the 7 times 7, and we see this immense revolution in terms of the world and how things are, what our peers have indicated previously is that a time will come when there will be an immense change in the world. And in the Quran, it refers to this as, we will show them our signs in the horizons and in themselves. the horizons being the world around us. And what the peers and thys have explained is there will be a time when there will be a revolution within what we see in the world around us. And after that is when the real awakening of our spiritual journey will occur. So this 7 times 7, absolutely from an Ismaili point of view, is looked at as a very specific point in time. But that cumulative effect actually goes beyond just the 7 times 7. And in the Quran, in 70 ayat 4, it says, "The angels and the Spirit ascend unto him in a day, the measure whereof is as 50,000 years." So remember, very early on, we looked at the fact that God spoke about a day of God being like 1,000 years of humanity. But here, God is speaking about a day of God being 50,000 years of humanity. And again, our peers and thys have actually explained this whole cyclical nature and what it means. If we look at that whole major cycle of the prophetic revelations, that is in a cycle of 7. We had the 6 major prophets, and then we have the cycle of revelation, the cycle of resurrection, which is known generally as Qiyamah. It is a cycle of 7,000 years, the 6,000 for the prophethood, and the last 1,000 for the cycle of Imamat that reveals more and more ta'wil about spirituality. And just as we had the sub-cycles of 7 Imams times 7 Imams giving us 49, we also have the cycle of 7,000, the prophetic 7,000, with another times 7, giving you 49,000, followed by a final cycle of Qiyamah, a major Qiyamah, a major awakening of spirituality. And that gives you your 50,000. So this whole concept of 7 is so intrinsically bound into our esoteric philosophy of how our cyclical journey and the journey of our own souls works. But that 50,000 is not simply about a measure of time. It has also been explained in a number of different ways. It has been explained when God talks about that his day is like 50,000 years of humanity. It is also an indication that the day of God is actually like us being in a rank of 50,000, God being at the 50,000 and us being down the bottom. And that rank of 50,000 is actually attributed to the Imam who is the confluence of 2 oceans, the Imam who straddles both worlds, the Imam who is the actualization of that saying of Maulana Ali, "Do not consider yourself a small body when the entire universe is in you." And the other indication that our sages have explained is that where for ordinary human beings that journey is a journey of 50,000 years, for the advanced moments, for the dedicated moments, for those who really dedicate their lives to spirituality, that journey can actually occur within a twinkling of an eye. It can occur within a very short time frame. And again, going back to Usul Din, Imam clearly said in Usul Din, all of you can be like Pir Shams, Pir Sadruddin, Hazrat Isa, Hazrat Musa. But the bit I didn't talk about was what he said after. And the bit that he said after was, "But I do not see the courage in you." And that is another explanation of what this verse talks about. That for those who do have the courage, that journey is a journey they will progress very quickly. But for most of us who do not have that level of courage, it is like a journey of 50,000 years. So the Imam's position is actually very key in this cyclical journey of awakening. And his day is like the 50,000 years of an ordinary person. But another thing to note about that as well is that all the prophetic messages that we look at, all the miracles that each prophet had, they are not specific to one prophet. They are not specific to one time. They are indications of what each individual who reaches that higher stage goes through. So if we look at that whole concept of Hazrat Noah as the ark that carried, what was the number? Everything in pairs, everything in twos. The Imam of the time is the ark. And in that ark exists everything. What do we say in our dua? وَكُلَّ شَيْءٍ أَسَيْنَاهُ فِي إِمَامٍ مُبِينٍ. Everything is in the manifest Imam. So let's try and now look at the impact of all those different things to understand our own goals. Because I don't do this for anybody else, I do this for myself. What does this mean to me? The first thing is that we need to see whether these things help us to reconcile contradictions. If we look at one of the first things that most children will learn, they will learn that there is a heaven and there is a hell. But there is a big dilemma around teaching our children purely just that there is a heaven and hell. Be good, you'll go to heaven. Be bad, you'll go to hell. And the dilemma is, if the concept as driven by Christianity and Judaism and even Islam in general is that my delivery into hell is a permanent delivery, then what happens to that Quranic ayat that God himself revealed, which said, from Allah we have come and to Allah we shall return? If I'm damned to hell forever, how on earth am I going to fulfill God's own words of returning to Allah? And if we have a look at that cyclical nature, if we have a look at how that cycle works, both these concepts of heaven and hell are not permanent. They are temporary. They are not about fire and brimstone. They are about our spiritual status. Heaven is not about some beautiful place with lots of maidens and lots of wine. Our perspective of heaven is about inner peace and satisfaction. Hell is not about being consumed in fire with your skin burning off. Hell is the hell of regret, about realizing that actually I can now understand that that's the route I should have taken, and I wasted all of that time not doing it. And again, the Quran refers to this. It talks about the fact that people will be running with light, and that people behind them will be asking to be given some of that light. When they realize in the spiritual awakening that this light is available to all and I've missed out, I will be begging for that light. It'll be a hell of regret. But is it permanent? No, because God is meant to be merciful. We do not have the concept of a permanent punishment. And what about the other dilemma we have? And this is very, very, very relevant to our children in the West, particularly, where we are all in a multicultural society, where we are dealing with multiple faiths, where this concept of I am better than you is not the thing to say. And the problem is, the contradiction comes when we have a linear view of creation. When we have God creates, you do your thing, and then you go heaven or hell. In that linear view, where I'm born, to whom I'm born, in which country I'm born, with what finances I'm born, with what physical capacity I'm born, seems very unjust. But if we change to a cyclical point of view, if we change to something that is a continuous cycle of evolution, of development, then those circumstances of birth, those circumstances that we find ourselves in now, are only about now. They are not about forever. They are part of our journey on a cycle. And the question we asked first was, well, where are we on that cycle? And when I see that person in better circumstance than me, are we actually at the same part of this journey? And fundamentally, our goal and God's ultimate mercy are actually about the same thing. It is all about the fact of from God we have come and to God we shall return. God's mercy would not be mercy if he had said those words and then left us to linger without ever having the potential of that return, and that return being at the level of fanafillah. And that is exactly what the Imam was referring to in Usul Din. And I'll say it again, in the chapter 8 of the memoirs, the Imam is very clear on this ability for each human soul to achieve its final potential. And the important thing that I think we need to take out of this, if nothing else, is that when we are speaking within a context where we have multiple faiths, we normally tend to talk about a competition between that faith and this faith. But our perspective is not that there is a competition. Our perspective is that there has been an evolution through these faiths. That those who call themselves Muslim now have been through Christianity, have been through Judaism, have been through the other prophetic revelations all the way back to Adam. It is not about competing religions. It is about looking at religion as an evolution. And that exactly as with the Sunnis and the Shias, and not continuing with the Imamate, the same occurs throughout that history of evolution where certain groups of people have continued with the evolution of prophethood and other groups have stayed where they were. But it is not a competing aspect, it is an evolutionary aspect. And then again, we have this whole concept of if we look at life as a linear thing, if we look at life as here's where I started and here's where I end, there are 1,000 questions that occurred to me as a youngster about why. Why is this the way it is? God made all this stuff for us to go through all this hardship, and then what? It's all done. Now what? Now what happens to me? And I could not answer the question. And there are several other questions that come out when you have this linear view which you cannot actually reconcile. And again, chapter 8 of the memoirs gives us a very clear hint of how to reconcile this problem. And that is that God does not work in a linear fashion. God lives through his manifestation. Remember that very first diagram of the two circles? From an Ismaili point of view, those two circles are intrinsically linked throughout eternity, throughout all of what we may call time. There is no point when one exists without the other. God's ability to show God is through the manifestation. It is through the universe. And likewise, our ability to understand God and ultimately to understand ourselves is being in this manifestation and struggling to find that search, struggling to find our real meaning. And the other thing that sort of resolves our dilemma about this whole linear concept is we talk about God being eternal, but we don't talk about the creation being eternal, because we talk about God creating. So creation was not eternal. But in the memoirs again, the Imam talks about our perspective being a perpetual creation, a never-ending creation. And a never-ending creation requires a cyclical nature. If you look at a circle, it is never-ending. I can go round and round and round and never find a starting or an ending point. And coming back to the first point I made in the first couple of slides, which we talked about last week, is that whole cyclical nature that's driven by the duality and driven by this continuation of change, is that dynamism is what life is. If you go and you achieve X and then you stop, then what was the point? There is no life, there is no movement, there is no activity. The only activity occurs if you have a continuation of cyclical generation. And one other point that occurred to me is this whole question of what is our purpose in life? And that when we have this very linear view of things, and we look at the injustices, we look at the inequalities, we look at how he has or she has more than I have, and we compare these things and we look at how unfair life is, we get into this mold of despondency, we get into this mold of unhappiness. But when we begin to look at things as a cyclical nature, as a cyclical evolution, then everything is relative. Everything is about, well, it depends where I am on this cycle, and it depends what I need to do, and it depends what effort I make for myself. And understanding that in this cyclical journey, what the real happiness, what the real goal is about. Go back to the saying of Maulana Ali, do not consider yourself a small body when the entire universe is in you. He who recognizes himself will recognize his Lord. So, in summary, for me, and I can only talk from a very personal point of view, a lot of what drives this kind of analysis is understanding my purpose in life. What is life about? Why are we expected to do these religious things? But it is then also understanding what the journey is about. If we're not clear on the journey we're undertaking, then are we going to prepare for the journey adequately? And if we are prepared to make that journey, and if we are prepared to target our particular goal in life, we then need to know how we traverse that path, how we traverse that journey. And that understanding means understanding the role of the Imam. And the specific role of the Imam is not about what he does with AKDN, is not about attending didars and listening to farmans. The role of the Imam on that journey is about his position as Majma'ul Bahrain, the confluence of two oceans. That person who has already achieved that goal of the journey, that person who straddles this world and that world, that person who has encapsulated soul and body as one all-encompassing reality. But the important thing in that is understanding that the Imam is a role model. The Imam is there to show you and me, this is what you can be. Back to Usulaydin. So that's where I'd like to leave that. I hope that's been of some benefit, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if somebody has it. Thank you, and Yalimadin.
Subhanallah, subhanallah. Great session and a great presentation, Zahir. Do we have any question?
Hi, this is Rashida from Vancouver.
Yalimadin Shida.
Yeah, I am so amazed with your lecture. Amazing, amazing. Very powerful, very good explanation. But I am so sorry I missed your last week's lecture because we had family emergency, medical emergency, and I couldn't. Is there any way I could get the recording of both of these?
I believe, Aziz Bhai, you have that recorded, right? So I think you could send that to her.
Yes, please leave your number, WhatsApp number, and we will send it to you as soon as this recording is available.
Great. So where do I leave the number? Right here?
On the chat, yes. Your
On
name
the
and
chat.
number, please. Yes.
Okay, how do I get to the chat? Sorry,
Okay, let me leave you my number. Go and write it down, please. And you can send it to me. 469 438 7688. Thank you. Any other question? You see the question on chat, Zahir? Is there a significance to the number 70,000?
Yeah. So yes, I did think about including that, but I actually left it out because again, it's quite a big topic. But absolutely, there is a significance to that number. But the significance of that number is actually a lot harder to explain because it really goes into the depths of spirituality and how Ismailism views the spiritual journey. But just in a very brief form, and I can give Aziz Bhai some references later on that he can pass on. There is this concept that, and I think in the Quran it refers to this whole concept of the 70,000. That in that journey of the spiritual growth, if you actually go to the highest levels of spiritual evolution, if you consider what has been said about the Imam, if you consider that the Imam being a role model is termed as wa kulla shay, that everything is in the Imam. The other concept that our peers and dais have explained is that those individuals who reach those highest levels actually generate copies of their own souls. In Quranic terms, it's known as they create angels. Okay, so the Quran refers to the creation of 70,000 angels. But in our philosophy, it is because of the unification of soul at that level, because the soul is not split, the soul is one thing in terms of the universal soul. But it talks about the copies of that soul. So it's about, it's very hard to explain in 5 minutes, but it is a very deep concept and a very relevant concept, particularly to Ismailis, that at that level of spiritual growth, your soul emanates beyond your own individual self. It has of a far-reaching consequence. And actually just reminded me that in the memoirs, and again, people really must read chapter 8 of the memoirs, the Imam indicates this in a very veiled language. And he talks about the individuals who have reached the higher levels of spirituality, and the term he uses is become centers of forces in the universe. They become centers of forces in the universe. And that relates directly to this concept of the 70,000.
Subhanallah, subhanallah. So there is the two questions. So they are both alluding to the same concept. You mentioned earlier about the Imams before Mullah Ali, and you said the Imams after each prophet, Natik, are called AZIZ. Were there any other Imams before those Natikin and in between those Natikins? These are two different questions. I just mixed it up.
Sure. So the answer to that is an absolute definitive yes. But if we actually think about this logically, if we have said that there needs to be guidance for people to progress, the whole concept of a guide is to guide people. We have now the concept of continual guidance since the time of Maulana Ali. There is an unbroken chain of Imams, and that is a fundamental principle we keep saying is critical. But if we then say that there are no Imams between Hazrat Isa and Hazrat Muhammad, then what happened to that 1,000 years of people who had no guidance? What about the people between Hazrat Ibrahim and Hazrat Musa? They had no guidance. So is that just from a merciful God? No. If they then go astray and they do things that they're not meant to do, you can't blame them. So purely from a logical perspective, we have to think carefully of how can that actually be true? And this is not something that, just to be clear, that I'm making up. This is documented within primary sources of Ismaili Pirs and Dais. And again, we can give you references. Imamat has been there as long as mankind has been there. And if you look at, I don't know whether it's a Ginan or whether it's just a saying of one of the previous Imams, but somebody can please guide me on that. But there is a very clear thing I remember my parents teaching me, that this world cannot exist if the Imam is not there. We have lots of things like that within the Ginans. And that concept of Imamat having to exist at all times. Why? Because the only way for a normal human being to traverse this cycle, this journey, and actually reach that inner world is through the guidance of the Imam. If the Imam does not exist, then there is injustice in our spiritual journey. So from an Ismaili point of view, wherever mankind has existed, there has absolutely been Imamat.
Thank you. What you just quoted is in Imam Akan Sultan Muhammad Shah, may our soul be sacrificed to the Imam, Farman quoting the hadith of Prophet Muhammad, that if there was a void of a world of Imam, then this world will not sustain. So thank you. That's great. And yeah, we cannot forget the Quranic reference 1771. Each people of each time will be called with their respected Imam. So we need the Imam so that they can be called with them. Any other questions? If we don't, we will let Zahir go. I know he's running an overtime. We thank you, Zahir, for all your time and knowledge and your hard work. And these slides, please share with us and we will share with your recording with all on our in our group. And thank you so much, and we hope that you will come and join us again soon. Please don't take too long
Sure.
gap. Come and see us. Thank you very much. Ya Ali
Thank you,
Madad.
everyone. Yali Madad. Thank you very much, everyone. Yali Madad.
Thank you.
Bless
Ya
you
Ali
all.
Madad.
Bless you all for all the sevas.
Amin. Amin. Thank you. Yali Madad.
Thank you so much.
This conference will now be recorded.